In the copies made from it, the Zayd copy, various readings naturally and necessarily sprung up, and these, under the Caliphate of Uthman, led to such serious disputes between the faithful that it became necessary to interpose, and in accordance with the warning from Hadzaifa to stop the people before they should differ regarding their scriptures as did the Christians and the Jews. Now, these dialectical readings and the modes of the dialects, these actually existed beforehand, and it wasn't just the copy of Zayd. Other people had copies, but as far as public copies. And didn't one of the Mongols receive one of the 7 copies of the Uthmani compilation? But there was over 500 different compilations of the Quran, and we don't have, because people wrote down from memory, and there's over 500 acknowledged, and there aren't contradictions between any of them, which is pretty interesting. In accordance with this advice, Uthman determined to establish a text which should be the sole standard, and entrusted the redaction to the Zayd already mentioned, with whom he associated as colleagues 3, according to others, 12 of the Quraysh, in order to secure the purity of that Meccan idiom which Muhammad has spoken, should any occasion arise in which the collectors might have to decide upon various readings. Well, that was actually the more basic one that was said, and therefore there would have been more people who want to find, okay, here's a dozen people that can verify that this is the reading. Although in that copy, only in that copy, by the way, do you find, well, we only had one person who learned the end of Surah 9, and you'll see that at the head in the Arabic and some of the ones. Copies of the text formed were thus forwarded to several of the chief military stations in the new empire, and all previously existing copies were committed to the flames. Well, no, anybody who had a copy, like Ali bin Talib and some others, but some people got rid of their scraps. Zayd and the coadjutors, however, do not appear to have arranged the materials which came into their hands upon any system more definite than that of placing the longest and best known suwar first, plural for chapter, immediately after the Fataha, our opening chapter, the 8th in this edition, although even this rule, artless the unscientific as it is, has not been adhered to with strictness. Anything approaching to a chronological arrangement was entirely lost sight of. Late Meccan suwar are often placed before the early Meccan surahs. The short surahs, gotta say the real plural. The short suwar at the end of this Quran are its earliest portents, while, as will be seen from the notes, verses of Meccan origin are to be found embedded in the Medina suwar, and the verses promulgated at Medina, scattered up and down in the Meccan suwar. It would seem as if Zayd had to a great extent put his materials together just as they came at hand, and often with entire disregard to continuity of the subject and uniformity of style. Now, if you listen in Arabic, you understand, and if you look at parts of each, you can understand. But longest to shortest, that didn't happen. Chronologically, didn't happen. The text, therefore, as hitherto arranged, necessarily assumes the form of a most unreadable and incongruous patchwork. One assemblage, says M. Kasimirsky in his Preface, informa et incoherent de preceptes moraux religioneux civils et politiques mêlés de exhortations, de promesses, et de menaces, and conveys the idea, I don't know if I said that right, but and conveys no idea whatever of the development and growth of any plan in the mind of the founder of Islam, or of the circumstances by which he was surrounded and influenced. Well, it does, because it can respond to different circumstances, and that's part of the thing, part of the glory too, that it wasn't pigeonholed by building too much by adding context into it or something like that, or changing the order according to personal ideas of how people think a scripture should be. It was put in the order that they were told. It is true that the manner in which Zayd contented himself with simply bringing together his materials and transcribing them without any attempt to mold them into shape or sequence, and without any, well, the narrations prove how very much that's quite not the case. And without any effort to supply connecting links between adjacent verses to fill up various chasms, or to suppress details of a nature discreditable to the founder of Islam. Well, Muhammad, just like Zoroaster before him, abhorred the founders of religions. They basically were the new prophet for the old religion, basically, to restore it. Just like Jesus in the Bible. I came not to do away with any of the law, I came to refurbish it. Fulfill it. Plorose does not mean that something happens and then the law is done away with. No, that's not what it means. Proves his scrupulous honesty as a compiler, as well as his reverence for the sacred text, and to a certain extent guarantees the genuineness and authenticity of the entire volume, but it is deeply to be regretted that he did not combine some measure of historical criticism. Well, that's what he did. The Bussamine did very heavily, is they followed down not only the narration chains and who was involved in the narration chains and whether there were variations, and how how did those variations deal with the secular science, and how did it deal with the actual what did the Quran have to say on the issue, and various things like that. With the simplicity and honesty of purpose, which forbade him, as it certainly did, in any way to tamper with the sacred text, to suppress and exclude or soften down what some would be considered to be inaccurate statements. Although, if there are any such things, people should step forward and prove them, right? The arrangement of the Suwar in this translation is based partially on the traditions of the Muslims themselves, with reference especially to the ancient chronological list printed by Weil in his Muhammad der Prophet, as well as upon a careful consideration of the subject matter of each separate Suwar and its probable connection with the sequence of events in the life of Muhammad. Now, isn't it a little bit different than the Al-Azhar or some other more directly scholarly thing? Noyaldi or something like that? So the Orientalists came up with a different chronological order list, I think. Great attention has been paid to the subject by Dr. Weil in his work just mentioned, by Mr. Muir in his Life of Mahomet, who also publishes a chronological list of Suwar, 21, however, of which he admits have not yet been carefully fixed, and especially by Noldeke in his Geschichte des Korans, a work to which public honors were awarded in 1859 by the Paris Academy of Inscriptions. From the arrangement of this author, I see no reason to depart in regard to later Suwar. It is based upon a searching criticism and a minute analysis of the component verses of each, and may be safely taken as a standard which ought not to be departed from without weighty reasons. I have, however, placed the earlier, more fragmentary suwar after the two first in an order which has reference rather to their subject matter than to points of historical allusion, which in these suwar are very few, whilst, on the other hand, they are mainly couched in the language of self-communication, of aspirations after truth, and of mental struggle, are vivid pictures of heaven and hell, are descriptions of natural objects, and refer also to men of Mecca at the outset of his public career. This remark applies to what Naldek terms the suwar of the first period. The contrast between the earlier, middle, and later suwar is very striking and interesting, and will be at once apparent from the arrangement here adopted. In the suwar as far as the 54th, page 76, we cannot but notice the entire predominance of the poetical element, a deep appreciation, as in Surah 91, page 38, of the beauty of natural objects, brief, fragmentary, and impassioned utterances, denunciation of woe and punishment, expressed for the most part in lines of extreme brevity, with a change, however, in the position of Muhammad when he openly assumes the office of public warner. Well, the whole Quran was as a public warner. He had dreams and he was a just person, but then he receives the Quran and then it comes from there. The suwar begin to assume a more prosaic and didactic tone, though the poetical ornament of rhyme is preserved throughout. We gradually lose the poet in the missionary aiming to convert, the warm asserter of dogmatic truths, firmly adhered to beliefs, the descriptions of natural objects, of the judgment, of heaven and hell, make way for gradually increasing historical statements, first from Jewish and subsequently from Christian histories, while in the 29 suwar revealed at Medina, we no longer listen to vague words, often as it would seem without positive aim, but to the earnest disputant with enemies of his faith, the apostle pleading the cause of what he believes to be the truth of God, who at Mecca is the admonisher and persuader, at Medina is the legislator and the warrior, who dictates obedience and uses other weapons than the pen of the poet and the scribe. When business pressed, as at Medina, poetry makes way for prose, and although the touches of the poetical element occasionally break forth, and he has to defend himself up to a very late period against the charge of being merely a poet, yet this is rarely the case in the Medina suwar, and we are startled by finding obedience to God and the apostle God's gifts, and the apostles God's pleasure, and the apostles spoken of in the same breath, and epithets and attributes elsewhere applied to Allah, the singular, the definitive term for God, openly applied to himself in Surah 9, 118, 129. Well, in a non-divine way, aren't we supposed to manifest the divine qualities except for the pride and the majesty? That's what Islam teaches. So in that respect, but if we look at the order of the actual Quran, we see some interesting things happening with that. And you throw in the issue of when it was. Was it Mecca, Medina, in between? Was it during this or that? Both these things played an obvious sort of role, both in the regular order and the chronological order. You can say that there's a different effect. But certainly in the translation, you're missing a lot of what you're going to see in the Arabic. So that sort of thing,